The wind carried the smell of dust and sweat, a ghostly hymn of the long road that had swallowed thousands. They called it a holy journey, a crusade ordained by God himself. But by the summer of 1099, what had begun as devotion had turned into delirium. The men who trudged through the heat of Palestine were no longer the same pilgrims who had once left the green fields of Europe. Their faces were burned by the sun, their lips cracked with thirst, and their eyes, those hollow, haunted eyes, were filled with something far older than faith. It was hunger. It was obsession. It was the madness of men who had given everything and found only more to take. They came from every corner of Christendom: Franks, Normans, Italians, Germans. They had crossed mountains that devoured horses, deserts that swallowed armies, and cities that resisted with fire and plague. The air itself had become their enemy. Now, beyond the valleys of Judea, Jerusalem shimmered like a mirage, the final promise of salvation. For decades, the name Jerusalem had lived only in sermons and dreams, whispered in the dark corners of cathedrals. To touch it was to touch heaven. To die before its gates was to die in grace. But as the Crusaders looked upon the walled city that June morning, there was no heaven, only stone and silence. The city stood on the horizon like a crown of bone. Its walls were thick and ancient, built by kings long forgotten. Within them, a patchwork of faiths, bloodlines, and prayers. Christians, Muslims, Jews, all calling upon the same God under different names. Yet outside those walls gathered an army that no longer cared for names. The Crusaders had reached the Holy City on June 7, 1099. Their numbers had dwindled to fewer than 15,000, perhaps a third of what had set out years before. Many had died in the deserts of Anatolia. Others had turned back or vanished into the sands. What remained was a hardened core of warriors, bound not by loyalty to kings but by a shared fever, a belief that they were instruments of divine wrath. Among them stood Godfrey of Bouillon, tall and austere, the man they called Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Near him, Raymond of Toulouse, grizzled and proud, who believed God himself had guided his sword, and Tancred of Hauteville, young, fierce, whose eyes burned like coals. Each man carried his own burden, faith, ambition, guilt, but together they formed a storm that was about to break upon Jerusalem. The Muslim defenders, under Iftikhar al-Dawla, the Fatimid governor of the city, had prepared well. Jerusalem's walls rose like a mountain of defiance, fortified with towers and filled with archers. Inside, supplies had been stockpiled, the wells guarded. The people prayed, Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians who feared both sides equally. To the Crusaders, the city was both paradise and prison. Its golden dome glinted like a challenge from heaven. And yet, beyond the glory of it, the soldiers saw something else: exhaustion. They had no siege engines, no water, and little food. They were at the gates of God's kingdom, but hell stood between them and victory. For days they camped on the barren hills, digging wells into the dry earth, praying for rain. The heat was merciless. Horses died where they stood. Men drank their own urine or the blood of their enemies. Still, they waited. Still, they believed. God wills it, he cried. The words rippled through the camp like fire on dry grass. A roar of thousands echoed across the valley. For a moment, even the dying lifted their heads. At night, the fires of the Crusader camp flickered like a constellation around the city. And from the walls, the defenders watched, silent, vigilant, knowing that faith could make men far more dangerous than hunger. Inside Jerusalem, fear spread like plague. The Fatimid governor ordered every well within reach of the enemy to be poisoned or sealed. No man was to open the gates. No mercy was to be shown. For both sides, this was no longer a war. It was judgment. On June 13th, the Crusaders launched their first assault. They rushed toward the walls with ladders and cries of glory. Arrows rained down like locusts. Stones the size of skulls smashed through shields and skulls alike. Blood soaked the earth. Men climbed over their fallen brothers, only to be thrown back again. By nightfall, the Crusaders had gained nothing but corpses. Yet the failure did not break them. It hardened them, because the promise of heaven was worth any suffering, and the longer they bled, the more certain they became that God demanded it. Weeks passed. Disease spread through the camp. The smell of rot mixed with incense. Every night, priests led processions, men crawling on their knees, weeping, confessing, begging forgiveness for sins yet to come. They carried relics, fragments of the true cross, bones of saints, banners dipped in blood. They believed that if their faith was pure enough, even the stones of Jerusalem would tremble. Then, in late June, from the port of Jaffa came salvation, ships bearing timber, sent by Genoa sailors. With it, the Crusaders built towers, vast wooden fortresses on wheels, taller than the city walls. The defenders watched in horror as the monstrous shapes rose from the plains like the hands of giants. Each day, closer. Each night, the sound of hammering echoed like a heartbeat of doom. On July 8th, the Crusaders stripped off their armor and marched barefoot around the city walls, a penitent procession in imitation of the Israelites at Jericho. Priests sang psalms, soldiers wept openly. They believed that with enough prayer, God himself would bring the walls down. Inside, the defenders laughed, but uneasily. They had seen what fanaticism could do, and they knew that the men outside the walls were not simply soldiers. They were instruments of something terrible, something holy and profane all at once. The final assault was set for July 14th. The night before, the hills were silent. No one slept. The Crusaders prayed in the darkness, sharpening swords, whispering to heaven. In the city, the defenders prepared oil and arrows, swore oaths to fight until the end. And above them all, Jerusalem, ancient, weary Jerusalem, waited for dawn, unaware that by sunset she would drown in blood. Dawn came like a blade. A thin, merciless light spread across the hills and caught the towers of Jerusalem, painting them in gold, the color of glory and betrayal. The air was thick with smoke from the night's fires, and every breath tasted of ash and iron. It was July 14th, 1099. The siege was over. The storm was about to begin. The Crusader camps stirred before sunrise. Men rose from the ground like ghosts, tightening their armor, murmuring prayers that blurred into one another. Some carved crosses into their flesh with daggers, marks of covenant and madness. They had waited 4 long years for this day. The city of God stood before them, and they would not be denied. From the east, Godfrey of Bouillon's men gathered beneath their siege tower, a mountain of wood, wrapped in rawhide to resist the Muslim fire. Its wheels groaned under its own weight, its timbers soaked in water, its ladders lined with sharpened spears. From the south, Raymond of Toulouse marshaled his Provençal knights before the walls of Mount Zion. And between them, the cries of priests carried across the field, Christ's army. Forward! The Lord is with us. Inside the city, the defenders lined the ramparts. Archers, soldiers, and civilians pressed shoulder to shoulder. Some had not slept in days. Others whispered verses from the Quran, steadying their trembling hands. They knew what awaited them if the walls fell. For word had spread, what the Crusaders had done in Antioch, in Ma'arat al-Numan, how they had left streets filled with bones and blood. Jerusalem would be no different. Then came the first sound of the battering rams, a deep, rhythmic thunder that shook the stones. Arrows screamed from both sides. From above, defenders hurled rocks, boiling oil, and fire. From below, Crusaders raised shields, pushing the towers forward inch by inch. The air was filled with a sound older than speech, the roar of men driven beyond fear. A flame shot down from the wall, a pot of Greek fire exploding against the wooden tower. The inferno roared to life, devouring everything it touched. Men screamed as their armor turned red-hot, their skin melting beneath the metal. But others climbed over the burning bodies, their faces streaked with blood and soot, shouting Deus Vult. God wills it. God demands it. God devours it. By midday, the plains outside Jerusalem had become a furnace. The towers groaned forward, their wheels sinking into the blood-soaked earth. Archers at the top rained arrows into the walls, while priests below blessed the dying, and stabbed the wounded who begged for mercy. Better to die pure, they said. No one was pure anymore. Then, a cry went up from the northern flank. Godfrey's men had reached the base of the wall. They raised ladders, scaling the stone under a hail of arrows. Men fell like rain. Some climbed again with broken limbs, clutching their crosses as shields. The defenders fought savagely, pushing ladders back, dropping stones the size of heads. The walls seemed alive, vomiting fire and death. But faith is heavier than stone, and madness does not yield to reason. By late afternoon, the great tower reached the wall near the northeast corner, facing the gate of St. Stephen. Inside it stood Godfrey himself, his sword gleaming in the gloom. He lifted his eyes to heaven, or perhaps to the smoke that hid it, and whispered a prayer that no one heard. Then he gave the order. The tower's drawbridge fell onto the wall with a crash that silenced both armies. For one breath, all were still. Then the Crusaders surged forward. The clash was like thunder breaking. Blades met blades. Shields splintered. Men screamed, slipped, and were trampled underfoot. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but the line was broken. A cross rose over the rampart, the symbol of Christ, now a banner of conquest. The city's walls had been breached. From every corner, the Crusaders poured in. Raymond's men, seeing the breach, renewed their assault from Mount Zion. Tancred's knights forced open a postern gate. The Fatimid soldiers fell back toward the inner quarters, fighting for every street. Jerusalem, the holy city, became a labyrinth of screams. Flames leapt from the wooden roofs. Smoke swallowed the sky. The dome of the rock gleamed through the haze like a mirage of gold amid ruin. And the sound, the terrible, endless sound, was the chant of 1,000 throats, Deus Vult. Deus Vult. In the chaos, the distinction between warrior and worshipper vanished. A man in a white tunic stabbed a child who clung to a doorway. A knight kneeled in blood, praying as he cut down a woman who reached for him. The streets became rivers of red, and still they shouted God's name. One chronicler would later write, "In the temple and the portico of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees." He was not exaggerating. The defenders retreated to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the last sanctuary. Hundreds of Muslims, and Jews who had fled with them, barricaded themselves inside. They prayed for a miracle. None came. The Crusaders broke the doors. They killed until their arms could no longer lift the swords. Then they stopped, not because of mercy, but because there was no one left. Outside, Godfrey stood upon the wall, watching the city burn. The golden dome shimmered through the smoke. For a long time, he said nothing. Then a priest approached him, blood on his robes, eyes bright with zeal. "The Lord has given us victory," he said. Godfrey nodded slowly. "Yes," he answered. "But at what cost?" The priest smiled, unable to hear the question. He looked at the carnage and whispered, "Jerusalem is purified." By nightfall, the city belonged to the Crusaders. Bells rang. Torches flared in every quarter. The air was thick with the stench of death and incense. Those who had survived, the few Muslims who surrendered, the Jews who hid, were dragged into the streets. Some were enslaved. Others were killed on the spot. The Temple Mount, once a place of prayer, became a sea of corpses. And yet, amid the ruin, men knelt and wept with joy. They believed they had brought the kingdom of heaven to earth. They believed this blood was holy. At dawn, the next morning, a procession moved through the city. Priests carried relics and crosses, singing hymns as they stepped over the dead. They made their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where they believed Christ had risen. Inside, they fell to their knees and prayed. Some wept for the horror of what they had done. Others wept because they believed it was beautiful. In that moment, faith and brutality became one, the two edges of the same sword. From the towers of Jerusalem, the morning light fell upon the silent streets. Dogs fed on the bodies. Smoke drifted from the ruins. The city had been conquered, but not redeemed. And though the Crusaders claimed victory, somewhere, in the ashes and the echoes, the soul of Jerusalem wept the morning after. Jerusalem lay in a silence heavier than any siege. The air was thick with smoke, blood, and the acrid tang of death. Streets that once rang with voices of worship and trade now echoed only the groans of the dying. Every stone seemed soaked in crimson, and every shadow whispered of lives extinguished in the name of faith. The Crusaders emerged from their encampments like wraiths. Their faces were streaked with soot and gore, their armor dented and blackened. Yet their eyes burned with a fervor that no battle could quench. They had conquered Jerusalem, but what had been conquered was only the city's walls. The spirit of man remained untamed, raging like fire. Godfrey of Bouillon walked among the ruins, silent. The streets were rivers of blood, the houses filled with the bodies of those who could not flee. A priest followed, chanting psalms over the fallen, sprinkling holy water where it could reach, as if purification could undo what had been done. "Father," a young knight asked, his hand shaking as he held a severed head, "is this what God wills?" Godfrey did not answer immediately. He looked to the sky, then down at the city he had taken. "We are instruments," he said quietly. "Instruments. What is done is his work. But the cost is ours to bear." Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, priests moved among the Crusaders, distributing blessings and absolutions. Every man was expected to kneel, to confess, to offer thanks for surviving what none could survive alone. Yet the air was heavy with contradiction. How could salvation be celebrated amid such carnage? How could a city of God be cleansed in rivers of human blood? The answer, for many, was simple. Faith demanded it. Blood was sacrifice. Death was mercy. And those who questioned were soon silenced by their own guilt or by the memory of the screams that would haunt their dreams forever. Outside, the streets were chaos incarnate. Soldiers searched houses for survivors, dragging men, women, and children into the open. Some were spared, taken as slaves or ransomed. Others were killed where they stood. Tancred of Vaudeville moved through the alleys with the precision of a predator, his sword a godly instrument. Every swing, every strike, he believed was sanctified. And yet in the deepest corners of his mind, doubt flickered like a candle against the wind. Could God demand this? Could heaven watch men butcher men in his name? No one spoke of doubt aloud. There was only action, prayer, and the ever-present chant, Deus Vult. Deus Vult. In the marketplaces, blood flowed in streams where grain and figs had once been sold. Children who had hidden in cellars emerged only to be met with the same steel that had claimed their fathers. Women screamed, some weeping, some silent with shock. And through it all, priests sprinkled holy water, as if blessing the carnage could cleanse the soul of the city itself. One chronicler, writing years later, described it as a baptism of blood. It was a phrase that captured the paradox of faith and cruelty, the union of devotion and horror. The city was holy, they said. The city was purified. And yet, for every step forward, every altar consecrated, 1,000 souls cried out in a silence no one could hear. Amid the slaughter, not all crusaders were unfeeling. Some knelt beside the dying, offering water, comfort, or prayers. Some wept openly at the doors of homes, lamenting the innocents lost. But these were the few. The majority moved as a single tide of purpose, unable or unwilling to pause in a city drowned in fire and blood. By evening, Jerusalem had become a theater of death. The gates were littered with bodies. The Temple Mount, once a sanctuary of peace, reeked of smoke and blood. The streets, alleys, and courtyards were silent except for the moans of the wounded. And yet, the victorious walked as if on sacred ground, believing their actions righteous, their sins absolved by divine decree. The aftermath brought moral dissonance that none could escape. Godfrey sat atop the walls, looking down at the city. He remembered the faces, the fear, the pleading, the defiance. He remembered the screams and the smell of fire and blood. And he remembered the weight of command, the knowledge that every life taken, every scream silenced, was by his order, or at least under his watch. A priest approached, offering a blessing. Godfrey refused it. He could not pray. Not yet. Instead, he whispered to himself, "How can faith demand so much? How can God require this horror?" But he did not voice the question. In the city streets, such questions had no place. For the citizens who survived, the city had become a nightmare. Muslims hid wherever they could, in mosques, in cellars, in caves outside the walls. Jews, who had long been a minority in the city, fled or were slaughtered. And those few who remained alive were paraded through the streets as symbols of conquest, living reminders of the price of holy war. By nightfall, the Crusaders lit fires throughout the city. They feasted on what they could find, drank from stolen wells, and celebrated their victory with hymns and prayers. Yet sleep did not come easily. The screams, the blood, the faces of the dead lingered. Faith had delivered Jerusalem into their hands, but it had also delivered them into the memory of horror. In the days that followed, Jerusalem was reorganized under Crusader rule. Fortifications were repaired. Religious ceremonies resumed. But beneath the surface lay the unhealed wounds of massacre. Even in victory, the city mourned. Even in triumph, the soldiers remembered. The chroniclers would later call it the glorious conquest of the holy city. But for those who had lived it, it was more complicated. It was faith and fear, devotion and horror, courage and madness. It was the baptism of blood. And for centuries afterward, the story of Jerusalem in 1099 would be told with awe, fear, and the uneasy question, can holiness exist alongside such horror? Can faith justify the cruelty it inspires? The city was silent, but not at peace. Jerusalem, once alive with the chants of prayers and the rhythms of daily life, now existed in a fragile stillness. The walls had been taken, the gates stormed, and the streets baptized in blood. Yet the victory carried a price heavier than any sword. Godfrey of Bouillon walked through the city, surveying the ruins. His armor was scuffed, his hands blackened with soot and grime, but his eyes held the sharpness of command. The streets were littered with corpses, some recently fallen, others decayed in the sun. Survivors, weary, broken, and fearful, emerged from hiding, and the sight of them was both victory and torment. Order must be restored, Godfrey whispered to Raymond of Toulouse, who had joined him atop one of the towers. Raymond's face, lined with fatigue and battle, betrayed a fleeting hesitation. Order, he echoed, but whose? The survivors, or the men who have killed for 3 days without pause? The city needed governance. Soldiers were divided into patrols, gates were secured, the dead were burned or buried where they fell. Markets were reopened under guard. Churches, mosques, and synagogues, wherever possible, were cleansed and repurposed. The Crusaders, who had marched as pilgrims, now ruled as conquerors. And with rule came responsibility, a weight few were ready to bear. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, priests administered blessings to the soldiers. They spoke of divine favor, of sacred duty, of the righteousness of victory. Yet outside, the cries of the enslaved, the wounded, and the displaced lingered in every alley and courtyard. Faith and guilt coexisted, their tension palpable. For many, the joy of victory was shadowed by the memory of what had been necessary to achieve it. Blood had sanctified the city, yes, but the cost of salvation was etched into every face, every stone, and every mind. Godfrey convened a council with the leading nobles of the crusade. The issue of governance was urgent. Who would rule the city? How would they defend it against inevitable counterattacks? What to do with the surviving population? Muslim, Jewish, or Eastern Christian? Many voices clamored for retribution. Some argued for leniency. Others sought wealth and spoils. Godfrey listened, weighing each proposal against the demands of justice and the dictates of faith. He knew that every decision would reverberate through history. Finally, he declared the city to be a kingdom, but refused the title of king, taking instead the title defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He would rule, yes, but not crown himself. In his mind, the weight of command was already a crown heavier than any gold. Meanwhile, the soldiers were restless. They had fought, bled, and killed in God's name, yet the spoils of victory were limited. Jerusalem was a city of stone, not of wealth. They had conquered faith, not riches. Some questioned the morality of their deeds, others justified them as divine mandate. The tension simmered. Raids were organized to secure surrounding villages. Supplies were gathered. Survivors of the city were employed as laborious, servants, or guides. The new order was fragile, reliant on both fear and devotion. The city had been won by blood, but it would be kept by governance and by vigilance. For the common soldiers, life became a mixture of ritual and routine. Each day began with prayers and confessions, followed by patrols and the enforcement of law. Some found solace in religious devotion, attempting to reconcile their actions with their faith. Others found only despair, haunted by the screams they had heard, the blood they had spilled, and the faces of innocents they could not forget. Even Godfrey was not immune. At night, he walked alone through the silent streets, stopping at doors where families had been killed. He touched the walls, the stones, as if seeking absolution from the very city itself. He prayed for forgiveness, but the city offered none. The cost of victory had been paid, yet the debt lingered in every shadow, every ruin. The survivors of Jerusalem faced a new reality. Muslims who had been spared were bound to servitude, their freedoms curtailed. Jews were expelled or enslaved. Christians who had once worshipped freely under Fatimid rule now owed allegiance to foreign conquerors. The city's fabric had been irrevocably altered. The streets, the markets, the holy sites, all bore witness to the violence that had claimed them. And yet life persisted. Merchants returned, children emerged from hiding, and the rhythm of daily existence slowly resumed. But beneath it all, memory burned. The events of 1099 would never be forgotten. Political intrigue began to emerge among the Crusader leaders. Alliances were fragile. Loyalties tested. Power struggled to assert itself amid the chaos. Raymond of Toulouse sought influence over certain districts. Tancred maneuvered to consolidate control over the southern quarters. Godfrey maintained overall authority, but he knew that ambition, jealousy, and greed could destabilize even the most victorious army. Letters were sent to Europe. News of the conquest spread rapidly, framed in tales of divine favor and glory. Yet behind the words of triumph lay the unspoken truths, the moral cost, the lives extinguished, the faith tested to its limits. For those who had marched, victory was a mixture of joy and horror, pride and shame. As Jerusalem settled into its new order, a solemn realization emerged. Victory was not an end, but a beginning. The city demanded constant vigilance. Defenses had to be maintained. Alliances nurtured. The population governed. And above all, the conscience of the Crusaders demanded reckoning. Some found comfort in faith. Others found themselves consumed by guilt, wandering the city at night, speaking to ghosts only they could see. The streets whispered to those who had conquered them, reminding them that blood could not be erased, that sanctity was fragile, and that victory carried a price heavier than any crown. Godfrey himself understood the paradox. The city was holy. It was won by divine mandate. It was a triumph. Yet in every stone, every corpse, every shadow, he recognized the cost. Faith and cruelty had walked hand in hand. Justice and violence had intertwined. The holy city had been purified, yes, but its soul had been scarred forever. He knelt in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, whispering prayers for the living and the dead alike. He prayed for mercy, for guidance, for understanding. And he prayed for the strength to lead a city that had been forged in fire and blood. The price of victory, he realized, was eternal vigilance, not only over the city, but over the soul of every man who had set foot upon its streets. Years passed, yet the flames of 1099 had never truly died. Jerusalem, the city of saints and sinners, had been conquered, its streets baptized in blood. The stones still bore the marks of siege engines, scorched timbers, and the footprints of thousands who had walked through fire and slaughter. The city's heart beat differently now, a rhythm of fear, devotion, and vigilance. Godfrey of Bouillon ruled as defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Though he had secured the city, he carried the moral weight of every life taken. The streets were littered with corpses, and survivors, weary, fearful, broken, emerged, a living reminder of the cost of victory. Chroniclers praised the conquest as divinely ordained, yet the truth was darker. Survivors, Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian, remembered the screams, the blood, and the terror. Jerusalem had become both holy and haunted. Generations would whisper stories of siege and slaughter, keeping alive the memory of 1099. Within the Crusader ranks, men struggled with the paradox of triumph and guilt. Some sought solace in piety, others in wealth or power, but all were changed. Faith and violence had walked hand in hand, and every night, the faces of the innocent returned in dreams. The city required governance. Godfrey balanced ambition and morality among the Crusader nobles, consolidating power while maintaining order. Patrols enforced law. Markets reopened. The surviving population adapted as best they could under foreign rule. Life persisted, but memory lingered, etching the cost of conquest into every stone and alley. Political and religious tension simmered. Neighboring territories planned retaliation. Pilgrimages increased. Tales of the bloody conquest inspired devotion and fear alike. Chroniclers framed it as divine favor, yet the deeper lesson endured. Holiness and cruelty were inseparable in the making of Jerusalem's new order. Godfrey, near the end of his life, reflected on the city he had defended. He understood that conquest, even holy, demanded a price. Faith could inspire courage, but it could also incite horror. Victory brought glory and guilt alike. Jerusalem was eternal, yet fragile in human hands. The legacy of fire endured. Jerusalem became a symbol of faith and violence, devotion and atrocity, triumph and tragedy. The stones remembered blood. The streets remembered screams. Faith and brutality remained intertwined, inseparable, two sides of the same cross. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 had been absolute, in conquest, in blood, in memory, and its legacy, forged in fire, would burn forever.